We begin with breaking impeachment news and an attempt at a do-over from Donald Trump's ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. Sondland has been in the middle of the impeachment scandal since his text messages with Ambassador Bill Taylor showed him moving a conversation about whether military aid was tied to those politically damaging investigations into the Bidens from text to a phone line. Sondland also a key player in pressuring the Ukrainians to open the investigations. Donald Trump saw it as a condition for a meeting with Trump. But before today, Sondland had not testified to his role in or even acknowledged that he believed military aid for Ukraine was also tied to the Ukrainians' commitment to the investigations into the Bidens. Sondland today amending his original testimony to include this dramatic admission that military aid for Ukraine was tied to a public commitment from the Ukrainians to investigate Trump's political rival. From the New York Times, which was first to report on Sondland's reversal, quote, the disclosure from Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, in 4 new pages of sworn testimony released on Tuesday, confirmed his involvement in essentially laying out a quid pro quo to Ukraine that he had previously not acknowledged. The Times adds, quote, Mr. Sondland provided a more robust description of his own role in alerting the Ukrainians that they needed to go along with investigative requests being demanded by Rudy Giuliani. By early September, Mr. Sondland said he'd become convinced that military aid and a White House meeting were conditioned on Ukraine committing to those investigations. To be a little more blunt, Sondland was in a box, at least one lawmaker accusing him of perjury for inconsistencies between his testimony and the depositions of Ambassador Bill Taylor and Tim Morrison. Both Taylor and Morrison have recounted detailed conversations between Sondland and the Ukrainians, in which it was communicated that military aid was conditioned on those investigations. Sondland now saying that their testimony refreshed his memory. In today's updated testimony, Sondland writes, quote, I now do recall a conversation on September 1st, 2019 in Warsaw with a Ukrainian official, Mr. Yermak. This brief pull-aside conversation followed the larger meeting involving VP Pence and President Zelensky, in which Zelensky had raised the issue of the suspension of U.S. aid to Ukraine directly with Vice President Pence. After that large meeting, I now recall speaking individually with Mr. Yermak, where I said that resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we'd been discussing for many weeks. Sondland's testimony is where we start today. From the New York Times, Washington correspondent Mike Schmidt, from the Washington Post, White House reporter Ashley Parker, plus former senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. With us at the table, John Heilman, NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst and former managing editor for Time magazine. Rick Stengel is back. Mike Schmidt, you broke this news of Sondland's planned reversal. Take us inside the strategy. Is he trying to avoid any questions about whether he perjured himself, or had he really forgotten these detailed interactions with the Ukrainians?
Well, the explanation from Sondland's side is basically that after all of these witnesses went in, he had a much better memory of what occurred. Now, if you look at the transcript,
right? September 1st.
Correct. If you look at the transcript that came out earlier today with that new testimony, you can see Sondland saying that he did not believe, that he thought that the military aid was tied to the investigations, obviously saying something very different today and, leading, many Democrats, into an interesting position, because I think they like the fact that Sondland has said this, because he is seen as a Trump ally. He's seen as someone that was close to the president, and that sort of enhances their argument that there was a quid pro quo. At the same time, it undermines his credibility as a witness, because you have him now in 2 different instances saying different things. And that can obviously be exploited if he's called at a public hearing to lay out for the country what he knows.
The politics of this aside, is there a single witness now that we know of that's testified to anything other than both the meeting and the military aid being tied to commitment publicly to investigate Burisma and the Bidens?
No, not that I know of. Look, we haven't seen every transcript yet, and there are still other witnesses that have not been spoken to. But this does put Sondland in line with a lot of the career State Department officials and these longtime national security officials that were working on the National Security Council for the president. This puts him in line with them and sort of their understanding of what had gone on. Now, what does that mean for Sondland going forward? I mean, that's the decision that Democrats are going to have to make. It's like, is he a good enough witness to put up there given these contradictions in what he said?
Ashley Parker, it reminds me, and Mike's analysis is similar to the analysis that a lot of us heard about Michael Cohen, who had kind of come before Congress in a dramatic way, but there were inconsistencies. The credibility of the witness aside, Sondland was the figure in the entire Aid for Dirt scandal who the White House had pinned their hopes on in terms of providing some sort of exculpatory testimony. It would appear that that has fallen apart with today's amended testimony.
Not just with today's amended testimony, but even with his first testimony. Remember, he went up and a number of people in the White House were excited, as you said, for him coming to testify because they thought, finally, you have someone who is an ally of the president, who has said in a text message there was no quid pro quo, and who will be a positive witness for the White House. And that ended up not to be the case even then in that moment. And so what we're seeing today is just sort of another dig undermining a witness they had hoped would be exculpatory, now providing more damning information on this deal.
Chuck Rosenberg, can you jump in on both Mike and Ashley's reporting that this is now a witness who, while he confirms the fact pattern, and I don't think any of us are aware of any testimony that suggests anything other than conditioning military aid and a meeting with Donald Trump on a public commitment to investigate Burisma and the Bidens. Take us through how a witness's credibility might be impacted by amending their testimony and just the power of the fact patterns that has emerged today.
Right. So it's not a good thing, Nicole. We see this all the time as federal prosecutors. There's version 1, there's version 2. Who knows with Mr. Sondland whether or not there's a version 3, 4, and 5. Bank robbers, drug dealers always tell you about the transactions or the robberies they think you know about. And they tend to omit the ones that they don't think you know about. And that certainly, as Michael and Ashley pointed out, undermines their credibility when they get on the stand. The thing we ask witnesses to do, and it's a really, really hard thing for some of them to do it, is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And those are actually 3 different things, right? The truth and the whole truth are not the same thing.
That's interesting.
And so what you might have gotten from Sondland this time is more of the whole truth, but I'm not convinced you got all of the whole truth. And it certainly makes him ripe for cross-examination.
Well, that's so interesting. I mean, what do you think is in the mind of any witness when they say, oh, my memory's been jogged? Do you think Sondland went in there thinking that Taylor wasn't going to tell the truth? Do you think there was a signal sent that they'd all tell the same? I mean, what makes someone go in? I mean, if you read the amendment, it's a stunning new anecdote, and it's extremely detailed, and it's from 4.5 weeks ago.
Right, and it doesn't seem like the type of thing you would forget. It doesn't seem like it's the type of thing that you would need Mr. Taylor or Mr. Morrison to remind you of. I mean, it's the central operative fact, Nicole. And so, again, I mean, perhaps analogizing too crudely to bank robbers and drug dealers, they only tell you what they think they need to tell you to get out of whatever trouble they're in at the moment. And then as their stories change, they become less and less valuable because they're less and less credible as witnesses. And I think you mentioned this, Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort's another example. We see this over and over and over again in federal court, or I should say in federal prosecutions. So it doesn't surprise me that we would see it here, too.
It's so interesting, John Heilemann. I mean, the picture in some ways becomes clearer. You have this testimony that syncs up with the testimony provided by Bill Taylor and Tim Morrison, specifically around this interaction with Mr. Yermak, which would seem to me, and I'm not a lawyer, but it would seem like CYA testimony that you now know there's sworn testimony from 2 other witnesses that involves you. Right. And so you make sure that your account matches theirs, sort of like busting, a high school misfits and their stories have to match up when they get called before the principal. But on the other hand, as Chuck and Mike have both alluded to, questions about his credibility now.
Yeah, I don't think this is as big a conflict as it sort of seems on the front side, because you think about where you're headed now, right? We're headed in from the period of private fact gathering to public persuasion. Democrats now are looking at the situation. It looked like public opinion was moving in the direction of impeachment and potentially removal. We now see that there's some mixed picture on that, especially in these battleground states. So the challenge that Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats have to try to move public opinion further is a serious one. They know what the story is here. They know what the truth of the story is here. There's no doubt that Sondland has damaged his credibility as a witness, but he was never going to be their real witness either anyway. Bill Taylor is going to be their witness. Yeah. Colonel Vindman is going to be their witness. Maybe John Bolton is going to be their witness. This guy has now done them the favor of removing the one piece of contradictory testimony.
That's true.
So they can now stand up and say, we have even the president's crony, even the president's bought and paid for ambassadorial pick. Even that guy has now come around to acknowledge the obvious truth of the matter. Plus, you get the pleasure of looking at Donald Trump's tweet from October 22nd. There's always a good tweet for this, the Donald Trump tweet that said, the ambassador to the European Union has already testified. He said there was no quid pro quo. He said the president had told him that. That is the president of the United States a couple weeks ago. That is now inoperative, too. Yeah. So it seems to me the benefit of having Sondland's testimony line up, getting him off the side of being the one contradictory, important contradict, the outlier, is way more important than what you would use. He's not going to be a good witness, but this guy was never going to be the witness you wanted to make your case anyway.
And just to pull the Michael Cohen analogy through, actually, you mentioned the original testimony. That transcript was also released today. That was the occasion for the update. And from the original testimony, I mean, Sondland is clearly another alarmed witness to what I think Bill Taylor described as an irregular policy channel. He testified, he was asked, when President Trump told you to discuss with Rudy Giuliani concerns about Ukraine, did you know at that point what he was referring to? Sondland, he wasn't even specific about what he wanted us to talk to Giuliani about. He just kept saying, talk to Rudy, talk to Rudy. Questioner, right, I understand that, and I understand he wasn't specific, but when he said that, did you know what he was talking about? Sondland, I didn't, other than he said, Ukraine is a problem. He went on to say it was getting more insidious as the timeline went on. The continuum was, first of all, an unconditional phone call and an unconditional invitation to the White House. And then I believe the next part of the continuum was some kind of a commitment to investigate corruption generally. And then the next part of the continuum was talking about Burisma and the 2016 election. And then at the end of the continuum, I became aware that there might be a link between the White House visit and aid to the Ukraine that was being held up when I couldn't get a straight answer as to why the aid was being held up. And then the aid was released, and then this whole thing blew up. Ashley?
Well, we talked a bit earlier about Sondland being in a box over perjury, but what you saw in this testimony released today and what had leaked out about it a bit earlier was he was really in a box in another way as well, which is Sondland was someone, again, he was a wealthy hotelier. He was desperate to please the president. He was so excited and eager to finally have this ambassador job that he had worked for years towards by being a Republican donor. And then the president was basically asking him to do a series of things that he felt increasingly uncomfortable with. And so he was always faced with this choice. Do I try to please my benefactor, or do I do the thing that I think is right? And you saw him kind of grappling with that in real time. More often than not, he tried to please the president. But that is why you hear those hints of alarm and concern throughout the transcript.
You know, I mean, Rick, we travel so far from normal. But it is normal for the diplomatic corps to be made up of people who are political patrons. President Bush did it. President Obama did it. And they typically meld, I won't say seamlessly, but more seamlessly than this into the diplomatic corps. Where Sondland didn't exactly do that, there is some syncing up in terms of knowing that something was awry with Giuliani's role here.
Yes, I mean, Sondland is a complete amateur. A lot of political ambassadors have some experience. The other thing that I keep thinking about with this and why people are getting dinged is that at the State Department, so he's accompanied by Foreign Service officers and long-term State Department employees. They take notes on every single tiny thing that happens, and then they send a memo about it, and someone takes notes on the memo, and then they send it there. It's all confirmed every which way, so all of this is going to be marked. The other thing, the detail that keeps coming back to me to haunt me, and it's kind of humorous, is this. And I think this is how one reason they got dinged. So this is in Sondland's refreshed memory. His memory was refreshed by the idea that he could be charged with perjury, I believe. That's a memory refreshment. But he said, I also recall some question as to whether the public statement would come from the newly appointed Ukrainian prosecutor general rather than from President Zelensky directly. Remember, they wanted the Ukrainians to issue a statement, a public statement that they were investigating Burisma. That came from Trump. That's the classic Trump thing of not only do I defeat you, I rub your nose in it so the whole world can see it. And that's where the Ukrainians balked. It's like, I'll do this deal. That's what diplomacy is. But I'm not going to do it in public and open everything up for everybody to see. That's what started the trigger for it to come back.
You know, and I think, Mike Schmidt, you and your colleagues did some of that reporting about a month ago about how this statement was, there was a lot of effort went in on the part of Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, and others to try to get the Ukrainians to do exactly what Rick Stengel just described, issue this statement where they publicly commit to these investigations. How does that effort and what we're learning about it play into sort of Sondland's disclosures in the amended testimony today?
Well, the charitable view of what Sondland was trying to accomplish was basically to conduct American foreign policy around Trump and Giuliani. He basically saw them as impediments to what needed to be done between these two countries. And basically, if they could satisfy Giuliani and get him to lay off, then they could go back to establishing normal relations. And that would be the best thing for the country. The problem is that the president and his lawyer were standing in the way. But it was all about pacifying Giuliani. These people that were working on Ukraine thought that Giuliani had poisoned the president's brain and given him all these different ideas about what had happened in Ukraine. And basically, to get that to stop and to get the president to lay off, they had to try and get the Ukrainians to put out the statement.
You know, Chuck Rosenberg, there is something sympathetic in that depiction of trying to work around a president whose mind had been poisoned against the Ukrainians, which is bonkers, but I believe that's what they believed, and trying to do the right thing, trying to get this military aid to the Ukrainians by any means. That is another one of sort of the subplots that comes through when you read through page after page. They're trying to be forthcoming with Congress, and on the page it reads, it's just asinine. But they were working around Rudy Giuliani's bananas, berserk sort of conspiracy theories, trying to get this aid release. Does that paint sort of a more textured picture of the scandal?
Well, yes, but you're a much nicer person than me, Nicole.
But I'm not.
No, you are. Because I understand your point about it being somewhat sympathetic. It's also somewhat pathetic because it isn't binary, right? You don't either, you can leave, you can quit, you can say, I can't operate in this environment. Now, I'm not saying that's what he should have done, but it's not like he has to try and find a way to make it work. If he's being asked to do things that he thinks are unethical or illegal or just yucky, which might be the technical word here, he can walk away from it. And he didn't. He tried to appease the president, and that's on him. I mean, it's also in part on the president, of course, but that's on Sondland.
It's on Sondland, and I'm not as nice as I'm more mean than you, Chuck Rosenberg. We could have this fight every day. Ashley Parker, I want to ask you not what the White House is saying, because I think we can all guess that someone's smeared, someone's a liar, someone blah blah blah. But I want to ask you if there's any effort at any level to understand the fact pattern, or if the entire strategy rests on sort of indicting the process and impugning the integrity and character of the witnesses.
Well, you do see Republicans on Capitol Hill, I think, are the most fascinating group to watch because they are desperately trying to, A, understand the fact pattern, and B, respond to it. And you see them grappling with that in these excerpts of the transcripts that have been released and in their public shifting testimony. So you have them going from, if you look back just a few weeks, to saying there's absolutely no quid pro quo to now, when they do understand the fact pattern, some of them are saying, OK, sure. So there was a quid pro quo, and that's certainly not ideal, but it is not necessarily, the high crime and misdemeanor of impeachment. And so they're very much trying to grapple with this in real time.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.